Despite the fact that the "what would Jesus do" saying has lost its meaning because of overuse and I think often a lack of thought given to it, I still sometimes find myself wondering about Jesus in the midst of whatever is going on. On Wednesday, when the charges were finally made public for one of the officers involved in the shooting of Breonna Taylor, I wrote a statement that I would have wanted to issue. I needed to do something. As I was writing so furiously that steam could be seen coming from my head and my computer, I thought, I wonder what Jesus' statement would be in this moment. Would Jesus be calling on protesters to be peaceful? Would Jesus make any demands on either protesters or city or governmental officials or religious leaders or those in charge of law and order? If Jesus had been in Louisville, where might he have been and with whom? As a mostly white congregation, we tend to think of Jesus as on the side of law and order, which sometimes we call peace. We've been taught to think of Jesus as calm and peaceful, full of wisdom, ready and able to teach about anything at any time. We, as white Christian people, some of us, sometimes hear Jesus' voice in the governor and the mayor decrying the outcome of the charges, at the same time reminding everyone that violence will simply make things worse. An injustice has occurred, they cry, and it's important that no one makes it worse by engaging in violence. Jesus is often the peacekeeper in our eyes. Which gets me back to the kind of statement Jesus might make at a time like this. While we who are white might think of Jesus as gentle and soft-spoken, I think there is much more to Jesus than we often realize. Here is my outrageous statement about what kind of statement Jesus might make, say in the Tribune or the Sun-Times or on WBEZ. You brood of vipers, how dare you take even one life for granted or act as if one life is the price that has to be paid for law and order. If no one has warned you to flee from the wrath that is coming your way, consider yourselves warned. Imagine picking up the newspaper and reading that opinion piece from Jesus. Who are the vipers? Our text this morning is not the one where Jesus called the religious authorities a brood of vipers. Our text is one that is in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and some would say summarizes everything you need to know about what is important to Jesus. I think this text is far more than a summary. I think it's a mission statement, a vision statement, a command, a definition, a dissertation, and a map all at the same time. The legal expert is said to be trying to trick Jesus by asking Jesus, what is the greatest commandment, and hoping to trap Jesus when Jesus gives the wrong answer. Instead, Jesus answers brilliantly and shuts everyone up in the process. In effect, Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love God with all of your heart and soul and mind and strength. And then says, here's what that looks like concretely. Love your neighbor as yourself. There are many religious people who wish Jesus would have stopped with the first part. Love God with your whole self. Okay, we'll do that. And then we can say we are doing it because we go to church, we give our money, we pray, we help people in the church, we go to Bible study, maybe we make food for hungry people. We do all the right things. But when Jesus says, and the second commandment is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, most of us should know we're in trouble. Some of you have read Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison. He was a German theologian who was arrested and then executed during Hitler's regime for his part in plotting to kill Hitler. He was horrified that the German Christian church was going along with Hitler, and he wrote some things from prison that were smuggled out. What he wrote was very unpopular at the time. He claimed that Christianity had to be separated from religion. He also claimed that he thought pretty soon we were going to enter into a period of no religion. What he was struggling with is that people seem to either think of God as far away in the heavens and not at all a part of this world, or they believed that God was in them, and that meant their private relationship with God was all that mattered. What was missing for Bonhoeffer was that people thought God had nothing to do with understanding life as it was every day here on earth. And that included trying to understand violence or war or evil people like Hitler. Bonhoeffer wanted people to understand the idea that relationship with God necessitated relationship with your neighbors, which lived out meant caring for and protecting and speaking up for and feeding and harboring your neighbors. In other words, the way one expresses love of and for God is in the very way one treats one's neighbors, which has to do with how society treats all people. The same is true for love of Jesus. If you are committed to Jesus Christ, if I am committed to Jesus Christ, our commitment will be obvious in how committed we are to our neighbor. Last week we talked about the spiral of violence that Archbishop Dom Helder Camara wrote about in the early 70s in Brazil. The spiral begins with injustice. When the masses will no longer tolerate injustice, the next part of the spiral is revolt. When revolt happens, the next part of the spiral is repression, which leads to even greater injustice, and the spiral goes again and just keeps going around and around. Helder maintained that the spiral has been in effect in most societies for centuries. The reason we don't seem to be able to stop it, or at the very least interrupt it, is that we focus on the wrong part of the spiral. All of our attention and energies go to the second part, the revolt. Camara points out that the only way to interrupt the spiral is by focusing on and changing the first part, which is injustice. What are the root causes of the injustices? For those in power, focusing on the injustice is a threat to their power, so they would much rather focus everyone's attention on the revolt. This past week has been an interesting case study in exactly that strategy. When the grand jury was about to announce the charges in the case of one of the officers involved in shooting Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, it was as if the pause button was pushed so that cities around the country could literally gear up for what everyone knew was going to be an unjust decision. What happened while the button was paused? The troops were rallied. The National Guard was moved into place in Louisville. In-person school was canceled that day. Mayors and governors, including ours, had emergency meetings around the country. Police forces were expanded and mobilized, decked out in riot gear. Commands were issued, and collectively we held our breath, wondering what the revolt would look like and consist of. It's a perfect case study for how we focus on revolt rather than injustice. In some ways, the mission was accomplished because 2 officers were shot in Louisville, and that became the headline the next morning. What so many people skip over is the part where it says officers in riot gear advanced on the protesters before it was close to the 9 p.m. curfew. So officers became violent in what is often justified by using the terms law and order, despite the peaceful, though angry and distraught protesters. We saw this same dynamic play out in protests here in Chicago this summer. What is our role as the church and as people who say we are committed to Jesus Christ? Believe it or not, our role is not primarily to be peacekeepers or peacemakers, though there is some place for that. Differently stated, our role is to interrupt and even stop the spiral of violence. Maybe at times that means being peacemakers, but it's important that we not be fooled into thinking our role is to tamp down the revolt. If we are to interrupt and end the violence, we must focus on injustice. What's helpful in that effort is to understand how violence manifests itself. Earlier, I read you some of the traditional definitions of violence, and then Robert McAfee Brown's suggestion that we need an expanded definition of violence. He uses the book Violence in America to look at 4 manifestations of violence. The first is the one that we're all most familiar with and how we would often define violence if pressed, which is personal, overt, physical assault. This is the one that is most obvious. It's when one person physically harms another. The second manifestation is institutionalized overt physical assault. This is when physical assault is practiced corporately. Some clear examples are war, when police forces who are armed are physically violent toward unarmed protesters, when the National Guard does the same with unarmed peaceful protesters, anytime force is used to maintain domestic power. The third manifestation is personal covert violence, which is when one person violates the personhood of another in ways that are psychologically destructive rather than physically harmful. Examples of this might be domestic violence, in which a partner is emotionally abused, or child abuse, in which a child is emotionally abused, or even when a Black woman speaks up for herself or her children and she's accused of being an angry Black woman. Personal, covert violence. The fourth manifestation is institutionalized covert violence, which occurs when the institutions or structures of society violate the personhood of any members of that society. Substandard housing, inferior education, lack of food, lack of access to jobs, lack of health care are all examples of this kind of violence. We have many other examples: redlining, all kinds. Mass incarceration and a justice system that treats people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color differently than it does people who are white are also institutionalized covert violence. Blaming the victim can be both personal covert violence and institutionalized covert violence. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I agreed to be a budget ambassador for the city of Chicago to get community input on the budget for 2021. I held 2 different budget roundtables, and the conversations were fascinating. The first roundtable I facilitated had a real synergy of thought and ideas. To a person, everyone in that roundtable wanted to see the city reallocate some of the police budget to go to public health and community services, particularly more services for those who experience mental illness. To a person, everyone in that roundtable thought we have too many police officers, we have the highest number of police officers per capita of any major city, and that we have the police doing things that other trained professionals would probably do better, such as mental health intervention, guiding traffic, answering nonviolent calls, which makes up more than 50% of most calls for the police. There were a couple of people on that call who would have pushed it even further and gone for completely abolishing the police. In the second roundtable, there was a little more diversity of thought. A couple of people wanted to see an increase in the police budget and in the number of police officers. They were concerned about the wealthier people they know who are afraid for their safety and afraid to live downtown in expensive high-rises and who want to see an increased police presence. Someone else in that roundtable pointed out that public safety means different things to different people. For some wealthy white people in Chicago, it means having police protect them from people who have been designated rioters and looters. For Black people living on the south and west sides, and for many other people of color, public safety means fewer police officers because often violence and injustice comes to them at the hands of the police. This is perhaps one of the most important conversations related to the city budget right now. What the city decides to do with the police budget will signal for all of us our values as a city. What will the city do, and whom will the city protect? And what is or where is the injustice in our city budget? Going back to my outrageous statement about what Jesus' statement might have been this week, who do you think the brood of vipers is referring to? And where in Louisville do you think Jesus might have been this past week? The honest answer is we might not ever know exactly or for 100% certainty. Part of the problem in any dialogue these days is that there is no room for not knowing something fully or for not being 100% correct. I honestly don't know what Jesus' statement would have been, though it was kind of fun to play with it. What I do know is this: Jesus was unequivocal in his teaching that if you love God, your love will manifest itself in how you treat your neighbors. And your neighbor is not just the one you know or love, or the one who lives next door to you in your segregated neighborhood. Violence in any form, covert or overt, against your neighbor is violence against God. Bonhoeffer didn't want people to over-personalize God, but it would be a big mistake to throw out the idea that each person reflects the image of God. There is that of God in each person, is another way of saying it. Part of the reason for loving your neighbor is that your neighbor is essential for your understanding and knowing and seeing the image of God. When your neighbor is the one who is your complete opposite in every way, it feels impossible. All of the people you have unfriended in social media, or at least in your minds or your hearts, those are your neighbors. Loving them doesn't mean agreeing with them or becoming like them or voting like they do. Loving them means recognizing they are people too, and any form of dehumanizing them is violence. And here's the tension. While loving our neighbors, we are also called to interrupt the spiral of violence by focusing on injustice and by creating just systems and structures and institutions. If it feels nearly impossible, that's about right. Jesus died trying to interrupt the spiral of violence. So how can we expect it would be anything less than nearly impossible? Amen.